Today in the EU, the beginning of Albania's accession talks.
It's called negotiation, but as a matter of fact, it's not very much a negotiation. It's much more a homework dictated by here.
Accession negotiations between Albania and the EU start today, 16 years after the country submitted its membership request to the bloc. The talks will focus on 5 boiling issues, including justice, financial control, and procurement, as Albania grapples with high levels of corruption, slow judicial processes, and limited media freedom. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm joined in the studio by Alice Taylor, senior editor at Euractiv. Hi, Alice.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So today marks the beginning of negotiations regarding Albania's enlargement, and you've been living in the country for the past 7 years. What is the sentiment among Albanians when it comes to being a part of the EU?
Albania was under a repressive communist regime for around 50 years, and towards the end of the regime, as cracks began to sort of appear in it, it became very obvious that Albanians were desperate to look west, to be part of Europe. They were very pro-European. The dictator had been looking towards China and Russia previously before completely isolating the country. So people were very keen to become part of Europe. They were under Ottoman occupation for hundreds of years. They wanted to get rid of that association in a way. And in fact, when communism fell and there were mass protests and demonstrations in the street, one of the chants that people were shouting and screaming was Albania wants to be part of Europe. And even today, when there are protests against the government, they chant Albania wants to be part of Europe. We want to be in Europe. Albania and Kosovo, where people are mainly Albanian as well, ethnic Albanian, they are the most pro-European countries in the Balkans, if not Europe, more than those who are even in the Union. We're talking, depending on different surveys, over 95% of the population are pro-joining the European Union. However, this number has decreased slightly in recent years because people are starting to feel that Brussels is messing them around a bit, that EU accession is out of reach, not just for them, but for Kosovo, for other countries in the region. They don't believe this political will. And they're also a bit frustrated with politicians from every side of the spectrum in the country who they believe have not done enough to bring Albania towards the European Union.
Let's hear from Mario Cucci, an Albanian political science student who commented about his faith in government reform.
In Albania, we have had judicial reform that has promised to fight corruption and uncapture, let's say, the state. There has been some progress in that with many high-profile arrests and cases from the current government as well. There was some optimism on that, but at the same time, people have also seen the limits of this judicial reform and pessimism increase again.
So they remain pro-EU. This is the direction they want. And it's not just because they all want to leave the country, but there is frustration and there is a lack of trust or a lessening trust in EU institutions.
And this frustration is largely understandable if we think about the fact that Albania first submitted its membership application in 2009. Now, why is it taking so long?
The answer to this question will depend on who you ask as well, but I think it's a combination of factors. First of all, there is no political will in the European Union, and I mean from an institutional level down to the member state level, there is no real political will for enlargement. Because, bringing in new members to the European Union, it stretches it to capacity. It might mean reopening treaties, which is something nobody really wants to do. But I also believe, and I know for a fact, there is a fear amongst some countries. If we bring in these Western Balkan countries, are we going to be flooded with more migrants? The fact that some of the candidate countries are Muslim majority or have people who identify as Muslims making up a large number of the population, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo and Albania and North Macedonia, there is a fear that bringing these people into the European Union, well, you know how the far right and the right think on these matters. So there is a complete lack of political will. There is a lack of will at the member state level for various different reasons. However, there are also problems in the countries in the region. There are problems with the rule of law, with democracy, with organized crime, and with things like aligning with core pieces of EU legislation, like green legislation, standards on food. I mean, we are so far away in many ways, but I believe that we shouldn't wait for the countries of the region to meet the standards of the European Union. I believe that they should be brought into the fold to help them achieve these standards. This could either be done by speeding up the accession process or a more gradual sort of approach.
And when you mention this reluctance, which member states are you referring to, and how do you think this will affect the pace of negotiations moving onwards?
All the big players, France, Germany, Italy, they give lip service about wanting the Western Balkans to join the EU, but I think in reality, they're not really pushing for it. But I think every member state has its hesitations, even those in Eastern Europe. And of course, those who have joined recently, such as Bulgaria, it doesn't want North Macedonia to join the European Union. I'm not convinced it wants other countries to join, but it's not necessarily the countries as such, but it's also the governments within them. So if you have a member state with a particularly right-wing or right-leaning government, I believe they are less likely to want these countries to join the EU. But I would say pretty much all of them, if they were completely honest, either don't want enlargement right now or at all.
Since you mentioned Italy and Albania have a strong political relationship. 1 year ago, the two countries made a migration pact that was deemed quite controversial, and yet now we see how many European countries are looking at it and thinking of possibly implementing it. Just yesterday, the first ship sailed for Albania, bringing asylum seekers that will be processed there and that first arrived in Italy. Do you think that the Prime Minister Edi Rama will attempt to use this deal as leverage?
Italy and Albania have always had quite a good relationship. There is a lot of Italian influence here. Italy also invaded the country many, many years ago. It's not that Italy will be sending migrants here. What is actually going to happen is Italy has set up 2 reception centres on Albanian territory. However, these centres are essentially considered as Italian land. So they have sort of temporary sovereignty over these centres. They are under Italian law. They are run by the Italian authorities. And physically, they're being sent here, but it's not like they're being sent to Albania as such. It remains part of Italy.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that Edi Rama's decision to do this is not so much in terms of wanting to sweeten up the EU, but I believe it has other reasons as well. For example, Italy has been a major recipient of Albanian migrants over the years during, pre-communism, during communism, when people managed to escape, and the fall of communism, and even today. So there are hundreds of thousands of Albanians in Italy. They're a huge part of the community. There is an ancient Albanian community in Italy as well, the Abresh. So I think he sees it as sort of returning the favor in a way. I also think he has an element of wanting to do things for headlines as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this was maybe a good opportunity. But also Albania has a history of taking in people in crisis. I'm not necessarily comparing as such, but we can talk about Jews during World War II. Albania was the only country with more Jews in the country at the end of the war than before. When the West withdrew from Afghanistan and the humanitarian disaster unfolded, Albania opened its doors and welcomed thousands of Afghan refugees. So Albania has a history of helping out in this way. Whether this deal is a good decision or not, I'm not completely sure. I think Rama sees that it could have some political benefit at an EU level. Definitely the fact that other countries in the EU are now eyeing this model for their own migratory issues is quite interesting. But I think he might be a bit dismayed that it is potentially weaponized by the right, because obviously he is a left-leaning politician.
And I want to talk more about enlargement negotiations. They have to follow a specific choreography. What will be the first step?
So it's a slightly different process now. What is happening is instead of one chapter being opened, they will now open a cluster which consists of 5 chapters. This is called the fundamentals, and this will tackle all the core issues, which are also, unfortunately for Albania, some of the biggest issues the country has. So judiciary and human rights, justice, security, public procurement, statistics, financial control. Okay, the last 3 are more technical, But the first two are highly politicized as well. We have problems with the judiciary here in various ways. There are allegations of it being corrupt, politicized, weaponized. But also, we underwent an EU judicial reform, which has not yet completed. It's been around 8 years ongoing, and that saw half of the country's judges and prosecutors either fired or resigned for ethical issues, corruption, etc. This brought the country's judicial system to its knees. The Constitutional Court was out of action, and there are currently backlogs of cases. I have a case in appeal at the moment. I was slandered by somebody. I sued them, and for the hearing for my appeal, we're probably looking at about 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
The backlog is insane, and this has caused a lot of problems in the country. And okay, this is small issues for me, but imagine you're fighting sort of a human rights issue or something really detrimental to your well-being or security or land or, anything like this. There are problems with the judiciary, with corruption as well. I mean, it's everywhere in every part of society.
Mario Cucci also gave us a glimpse into his perspective as a citizen in the country.
Most people take it for granted that there will be some level of corruption involved if you are taking a case. For most Albanians, like, the healthcare system is generally the place where you will see most corruption. It's a given that without bribes or anything, some services will not be accessed to you.
So I think the EU, in a way, screwed up Albania a bit by putting these first. Obviously, these are core European values and have to be addressed, but it's going to take a lot of work. I think other chapters can be sort of opened and closed a lot quicker because they are more technical in nature. When we talk about food, when we talk about environment, procurement, statistics, education, they all have their challenges. But when we're talking about justice, human rights, democracy, corruption, this is intertwined with politics, and that's when it becomes very, very complicated.
And speaking of political choices, originally Albania's bid was coupled with North Macedonia's. However, due to several disputes, Albania's accession process is now moving forward while North Macedonia's has stalled. Earlier this month, the president had compared the situation to waiting for Godot back at the United Nations Security Council. Now, why did the decoupling happen in the first place? And is there any hope that, North Macedonia's trajectory will differ from the play by Samuel Beckett?
In my view, what happened with Albania and North Macedonia was shameful. Not only was the process held up for many years by Bulgaria, but now North Macedonia is being completely held back from any progression. There's no end in sight, and this is all because of one member state. And I think this is terrible. I mean, to have this sort of veto power just because of one little issue or perceived issue, nationalist issue. The process was held up because Bulgaria objects to North Macedonia's very existence, really. They want Bulgarians to be included as an official minority under the constitution, and they held up the process until this was agreed on. But the problem is that the government in North Macedonia can only pass such a change to the constitution with a political majority, which they don't have, which Bulgaria knew. So Bulgaria put down this condition, knowing full well it's never going to happen, or not in this lifetime anyway. This is all done for politics. What about the actual people? Bulgaria says, our citizens there are being treated badly, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but you're stopping them from joining the European Union. Now there is a government in Skopje which is very nationalist, has some pro-Russian sympathies, and they're never going to agree on this point. And this plays into the hands of Bulgaria as well. But it was Bulgaria's pushing of this and the halting of EU accession for North Macedonia, which resulted in the population voting for this party. So, I mean, this is terrible. There should be mechanisms in place to stop countries from vetoing countries' accession for these sort of reasons. That it's a weaponization. It's really, really terrible. I mean, we're going to see it with Kosovo as well. And instead of being welcomed into the fold of the European Union and being given a glimmer of hope and some assistance, they're being left out in the cold. Why? Because a couple of states have other political interests. This is a shame on the EU, in my opinion. And I do not think states should be able to have sort of the power to stop someone's accession just like that for a nationalist reason.
Mm-hmm. Especially now that enlargement has been declared a priority due to the war in Ukraine. Do you anticipate an acceleration in the timeline for Albania's accession, or do you think that these nationalist concerns are going to take priority?
I don't think Albania's process is going to speed up necessarily, but I do think there are some developments that we shouldn't overlook. So the Western Balkan Growth Plan, which was announced this time last year, maybe a bit later this time last year, this will help harmonise the single market. It gives big cash injections, and there are incentives for Albania and other countries in the region. If they meet these milestones, they will benefit from this, etc. So this, in a way, I mean, it does help the countries prepare for accession, but I don't think there's any way to speed it up when there is a lack of political will at an institutional level and an EU member state level. Prime Minister Edi Rama made headlines in an interview with me a couple of years ago. He said basically that Greece and others cheated when they joined the EU. And I think he was right in a way, because I don't think countries like Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, maybe even Croatia were really ready to join the EU when they did. And I think now the countries of the Western Balkans are being held to a much higher sort of standard, if you will, than the previous round of countries were. And I think this is unfair. I think the EU doesn't want to lose face. It doesn't want to admit the process is stagnant, especially in the geopolitical context with Russia, with China's influence in the region as well. But I think the reality is there is a long road ahead. Charles Michel said, by 2030, but he's out of a job pretty soon. So who knows?
Thank you, Alice.
Thank you very much.
I'm Jada Santana, and this was Euractivist Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractivist to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This podcast was produced by Miriam Sanchez Tejada, Charles Cohen, and I. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.